At 1340 on January 28, 1944, Roi-Namur Island, Marshall Islands. 5:47 hours. The dawn broke reluctantly over the Pacific, a hesitant light filtering through layers of smoke and coral dust that hung in the air like funeral veils. Corporal Tony Stein crouched in a shallow crater, his fingers wrapped around a weapon that should not have existed. A Browning Point .30 caliber aircraft machine gun he had stripped from a wrecked Navy fighter, modified with scavenged parts, fed by a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. The metal was still cold from the night, but it would be screaming hot soon enough. Around him, the island trembled with the distant thunder of naval bombardment, each concussion sending tremors through the volcanic sand beneath his boots. He could taste salt and cordite, that particular flavor of amphibious warfare that coated the tongue and throat and lungs. The Japanese bunkers ahead were invisible in the pre-dawn darkness, but he knew they were there, waiting, watching, ready to transform the beach into an abattoir the moment American Marines emerged from the surf. If you want to witness how one Marine with a homemade weapon destroyed 26 Japanese positions in a single day, hit that like button, share this story, and subscribe so you never miss these untold tales of World War II. Stein was 23 years old, a toolmaker from Dayton, Ohio, who had learned precision work in factories before he learned to kill. He wore the drab utility uniform of the United States Marine Corps, already stained with sweat despite the morning chill, and on his head sat a helmet that felt inadequate against what was coming. In his mind, he carried no illusions about glory. He had already seen Guadalcanal, had already watched friends die in ways that defied the imagination. But he had also seen something else, something that would define this day and all the days that followed. He had seen that when American industry turned its attention to war, it produced not just weapons, but an overwhelming tide of material that could break any defense, dissolve any fortification, render obsolete any notion of fanatical resistance through sheer, inexhaustible abundance. The battle for Roi-Namur would officially begin in 13 minutes. Tony Stein would spend the next hours doing something that military historians would later struggle to categorize. Not a suicide charge, not a tactical maneuver, but a sustained, methodical dismantling of Japanese defensive positions through a combination of technical skill, physical endurance, and a weapon philosophy that married American innovation with combat necessity. But to understand what happened on that beach and what it meant when a single Marine destroyed 26 fortified positions in a single day, we must first understand what the Japanese defenders expected to face and what they had been told about the Americans who were coming for them. Throughout 1943, Japanese military intelligence had compiled extensive dossiers on American fighting capabilities in the Pacific Theater. The assessments were clinical, detailed, and fundamentally flawed. Japanese officers studied photographs of American Marines, noting their equipment, their tactics, their apparent disorganization compared to the rigid discipline of imperial forces. They analyzed captured American rations, canned meat, chocolate bars, cigarettes, and concluded that these were soldiers softened by luxury, incapable of the spiritual strength required for sustained combat. The Japanese military philosophy, forged in the crucible of Bushido tradition and tempered by brutal training regimens that bordered on torture, held that material abundance was a weakness, that true strength came from deprivation, from the willingness to endure suffering that would break lesser men. The defensive fortifications on Roi-Namur reflected this philosophy. Japanese engineers had spent months transforming the Twin Islands into a fortress archipelago, a network of reinforced concrete bunkers, palm log pillboxes, and interlocking fields of fire designed to funnel any amphibious assault into predetermined kill zones. They had Type 95 Hago light tanks dug into revetments, their 37mm guns covering the beaches. They had buried explosives beneath the coral sand, strung wire across the approaches, positioned machine gun nests to create crossfires that would turn the shallow water red. The defenders numbered approximately 3,500 men, a garrison that included Korean laborers pressed into combat roles and Japanese naval infantry who had been told, explicitly and repeatedly, that American Marines would break against Japanese defenses like water against stone. This conviction was not mere propaganda. It was supported by Japanese experiences earlier in the war, when American forces at Wake Island and the Philippines had been overrun, when the myth of Western military superiority had been shattered by rapid Japanese victories across the Pacific. The soldiers waiting in the Roi-Namur bunkers believed they were defending not just coral and sand, but a spiritual truth, that material wealth could never overcome spiritual dedication, that American abundance was a fatal corruption, and that when American Marines finally came ashore, they would discover that all their equipment, all their supplies, all their industrial might meant nothing against men prepared to die for their emperor. They were about to learn otherwise. The weapon Tony Stein carried into battle that morning was itself a testament to American adaptability, a crude but devastating example of what happened when industrial know-how met combat necessity. He called it the Stinger. Though no official military designation existed for it, the weapon began as an ANM-2 Browning machine gun, designed for aircraft use, capable of firing .30-06 ammunition at a rate approaching 1,200 rounds per minute. Stein had acquired it from a wrecked Navy fighter on an airstrip, recognizing immediately that the weapon's rate of fire and reliability could be devastating in ground combat if someone could solve the problems of weight, mounting, and ammunition feed. Working with a fellow Marine armorer, Stein had stripped away the aircraft mounting brackets, added a crude stock fashioned from salvaged wood and metal, rigged a canvas bag feed system to replace the belt-fed mechanism designed for aircraft use. The resulting weapon weighed approximately 30 pounds loaded, fired from the hip or shoulder, and could empty its ammunition supply in seconds. It was, by conventional military standards, ridiculous, too heavy for sustained carry, too fast-firing for ammunition conservation, too unreliable for official procurement. It was also in the hands of someone who understood its capabilities and limitations, capable of suppressing multiple defensive positions simultaneously, of delivering such overwhelming firepower that Japanese defenders would confuse a single Marine with an entire squad. This was American warfare philosophy made manifest. Not the spiritual dedication to endure suffering, but the technical innovation to eliminate the need for such suffering. Where Japanese training emphasized the ability to survive on minimal rations and fight with inadequate weapons, American logistics emphasized ensuring that Marines never fought without overwhelming material support. The difference was not just philosophical, but practical, measurable in tons of supplies landed per division, in rounds of ammunition available per rifleman, in the industrial capacity to replace losses faster than combat could inflict them. The Japanese defenders on Roi-Namur had been told that American abundance was weakness. They had not been told that abundance, properly applied, could become the most devastating weapon of all. The landing craft hit the beach at 600 hours precisely, ramps dropping into shallow water, still churning with the debris of preliminary bombardment. Tony Stein was among the first wave, moving through knee-deep water with the Stinger held high, its 30-pound weight already burning his shoulders and arms. The beach ahead was a landscape of shattered palm trees and smoking craters, the naval bombardment having transformed the once idyllic atoll into something resembling the surface of a hostile planet. But beneath that devastation, the Japanese bunkers remained intact, their reinforced concrete having absorbed the shock of high explosive shells, and now, as Marines emerged from the water, those bunkers began to wake. The sound came first, the distinctive rip of Japanese Nambu machine guns, a higher-pitched bark than American weapons, followed immediately by the crack of rifle fire from concealed positions. Marines began dropping in the shallow water, some hit, others seeking cover that did not exist on the exposed beach. The plan, such as it was, called for infantry to advance under cover of supporting fire to identify defensive positions and call in tank support or engineer teams with demolition charges. The plan assumed coordination, communication, time. Tony Stein did not wait for the plan. He moved up the beach at a running crouch, the Stinger already firing, hosing the tree line with .30 caliber rounds, at a rate that sounded like tearing fabric amplified to thunderous volume. The first Japanese position he encountered was a palm log pillbox, its firing slit spitting tracers toward the waterline. Stein hit it with a sustained burst, the aircraft-grade ammunition punching through the log reinforcement, ricocheting inside the confined space, transforming the interior into a chamber of fragmenting metal. The Japanese fire ceased. Stein moved forward. What happened next would be documented in after-action reports, verified by multiple witnesses, and still seem impossible. Over the next hour, Tony Stein conducted 8 separate ammunition runs, charging forward to engage Japanese positions, with the Stinger until the weapon ran dry, then sprinting back to the beach to reload from ammunition, stockpiles being landed by follow-up waves. Each run carried him deeper into the Japanese defensive network, each engagement lasting only seconds, but destroying pillboxes, bunkers, and fortified positions that should have required tank support or airstrikes to eliminate. The Japanese defenders adapted quickly, shifting fire to target this single Marine, who seemed to be everywhere at once. But they faced a problem their training had not prepared them to solve. The Stinger's rate of fire was so overwhelming, its suppressive effect so complete, that by the time Japanese defenders identified Stein's position and prepared to engage, he had already moved, already hit them with another burst, already shifted to the next threat. He was not fighting with spiritual dedication or willingness to die. He was fighting with industrial firepower, with a weapon system that traded ammunition, expenditure for tactical flexibility that embodied the American approach to warfare. When in doubt, apply more resources. By mid-morning, Stein had personally destroyed 8 fortified positions. By noon, the count had reached 15. He had been wounded twice, minor shrapnel injuries that he ignored, and the Stinger itself had malfunctioned 3 times, requiring field repairs that Stein conducted under fire using the same precision tool-making skills he had learned in Dayton factories. Other Marines began to advance in his wake, exploiting the gaps he created, but Stein continued forward, driven by something that witnesses would later struggle to articulate. Not bloodlust, not recklessness, but a kind of focused professionalism, a craftsman's approach to the business of breaking enemy defenses. The Japanese garrison commander, watching this impossible advance through field glasses from a command bunker further inland, must have experienced a profound cognitive dissonance. His training, his philosophy, his entire worldview insisted that such individual action should fail, that American Marines, softened by abundance and lacking spiritual strength, would break under sustained fire. Instead, he was watching his carefully constructed defensive network dissolve, position by position, under the assault of a single enemy who refused to follow the rules of engagement that Japanese military theory considered immutable. By early afternoon, the temperature on Roi-Namur had climbed past 90 degrees, the tropical sun turning the coral sand into a reflective furnace. Tony Stein's uniform was soaked through with sweat, his hands blistered from the Stinger's overheating barrel, his body running on adrenaline and the chemical cocktail of sustained combat. The ammunition situation had become critical. The Stinger consumed rounds so rapidly that supply sergeants were struggling to keep pace with his demands. But the Japanese defensive line was fracturing, its carefully planned interlocking fields of fire now disrupted, its communication network severed by the destruction of command bunkers. It was during this phase that Stein encountered the Type 95 Heigo tanks, Japanese armor that had been dug into revetments to serve as mobile pillboxes. These were light tanks by American standards, mounting 37mm main guns and machine guns, their thin armor adequate against rifle fire, but vulnerable to anti-tank weapons. The Marines landing on Roi-Namur carried bazookas for precisely this contingency, but the tank positions were situated to provide mutual support, covering each other's flanks, requiring coordinated assault to eliminate. Stein approached the first tank emplacement alone, the Stinger held at hip level, moving in short rushes between shell craters. The tank's machine gun opened fire, tracers cutting the air above his head, but the crew's visibility was limited by the narrow vision slits, and Stein used this limitation with the precision of an engineer who understood mechanical constraints. He closed to within 20 yards, then opened fire on the tank's vision ports, not attempting to penetrate the armor, but to blind the crew, forcing them to button up completely. While they were disoriented, he moved to the tank's flank, located the engine deck, and emptied the Stinger's remaining ammunition into the cooling vents and fuel tank access. The tank did not explode dramatically. Instead, it simply died, engine seizing from fragmented metal in the cooling system, crew abandoning it through the emergency hatches, fleeing into the jungle undergrowth where other Marines cut them down. Stein moved to the next tank position and repeated the process, and the next, and the next. The Japanese defenders watching this assault were experiencing something beyond tactical defeat. They were watching the dissolution of a belief system. They had been taught that American Marines were soft, that American abundance was spiritual weakness, that material superiority could be overcome by dedication and willingness to sacrifice. But here was an American who brought his own abundance with him, who carried firepower equivalent to an entire squad, who used technical knowledge as a weapon more effective than spiritual dedication. When he ran out of ammunition, he simply went back for more, because American logistics ensured that more was always available. When his weapon broke, he fixed it, because American industrial training had given him skills that Japanese military discipline considered unimportant. When he encountered obstacles that should have stopped a single soldier, he applied overwhelming firepower, because American manufacturing had produced enough ammunition that such expenditure was tactically viable. This was not the warfare of spiritual strength. This was the warfare of industrial capacity, and the Japanese defenders had no counter for it that their training had prepared them to employ. By late afternoon, Tony Stein had destroyed 26 fortified positions, pillboxes, bunkers, tank emplacements, machine gun nests. The exact count would be verified later by combat engineers who surveyed the battlefield, examining the destroyed positions and correlating them with witness accounts. 26 defensive installations that should have required platoon-level assaults, tank support, or airstrikes, eliminated by a single Marine with a homemade weapon and an apparently inexhaustible determination to keep moving forward. The Japanese garrison on Roi-Namur would be effectively destroyed by nightfall, the survivors retreating to caves and bunkers, where they would be systematically eliminated over the following days. But the battle itself had already been decided during those first crucial hours, when Tony Stein's assault had shattered the defensive line's cohesion, creating breaches that follow-on forces could exploit. Military analysts would later describe his actions as having the tactical impact of an entire company, compressing into individual performance what should have required coordinated unit action. But the significance of what happened on Roi-Namur extended beyond tactical success. The Japanese military philosophy, with its emphasis on spiritual strength over material abundance, had encountered a fundamental contradiction it could not resolve. The American approach to warfare, the belief that industrial capacity, technical innovation, and overwhelming material support could substitute for suicidal dedication, had been validated in the most direct way possible. A single Marine, properly equipped and supplied, had accomplished what Japanese doctrine insisted required spiritual transformation and willingness to die. The Marines who fought alongside Stein that day would remember specific images, the way the Stinger's barrel glowed cherry red during sustained fire, the methodical way Stein moved between targets, not rushing, but not hesitating, applying firepower with the precision of a craftsman. The ammunition runs back to the beach, Stein sprinting through fire to reload, because American logistics had ensured that ammunition was available, that there was always more, that running out was an inconvenience rather than a death sentence. The Japanese defenders who survived would remember something different. The sound of that weapon, like tearing silk, amplified beyond endurance. The way positions that should have been impregnable simply ceased to exist. The growing realization that their training, their philosophy, their entire conception of warfare had failed to account for an enemy who brought abundance to battle and used it without hesitation or shame. There is a photograph taken on Roi-Namur 3 days after the battle, showing Tony Stein standing beside a disabled Japanese Type 95 tank, the Stinger slung across his shoulder. The image is grainy, the contrast harsh in the tropical sunlight, but certain details emerge clearly. The tank behind him shows multiple impact points around its vision ports and engine deck, the signature of the Stinger's concentrated fire. Stein himself looks exhausted, his uniform still stained, his face showing the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans recognize instantly. But there is something else in his posture, a kind of satisfied professionalism, the expression of a craftsman who has completed difficult work and knows it was done well. The photograph would not become iconic. It would not appear on recruiting posters or propaganda films. Tony Stein's story would remain largely unknown outside Marine Corps circles, overshadowed by larger battles, more famous names, the grand strategic narrative of the Pacific War. But the photograph captures something essential about American warfare in the 20th century: the transformation of combat from a test of spiritual dedication into an exercise in applied industrial capacity. The Stinger itself would survive the war, eventually finding its way to a military museum where it sits today behind glass, labeled with a small plaque that provides basic specifications and a brief description of its combat use. Visitors who pause to examine it typically express surprise at how crude it appears, how improvised, how unlike the precision-engineered weapons they associate with American military technology. They miss the point. The Stinger was not elegant because it did not need to be. It was effective because American industry had produced enough raw materials, enough ammunition, enough supporting infrastructure that a Marine could afford to build a weapon that consumed resources at a prodigal rate and still be assured of resupply. Japanese military philosophy never found an adequate response to this reality. Throughout the remainder of the Pacific War, Japanese forces would continue to emphasize spiritual strength, to train soldiers to survive on minimal rations and fight with inadequate weapons, to celebrate death in service to the emperor as the ultimate expression of martial virtue. American forces would continue to emphasize logistics, training, and overwhelming material support, ensuring that Marines landed with more ammunition than they could carry, more supplies than they could consume, more equipment than they could employ. The philosophical gap between these approaches would never close. It would simply be resolved through combat, position by position, island by island, until Japanese military power was exhausted not through lack of dedication, but through inability to compete with American industrial output. Tony Stein received the Medal of Honor for his actions on Roi-Namur, the citation reading in part, for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. He would be killed in action on Iwo Jima in March 1945, shot by a Japanese sniper while leading another assault, dying at 24 in the volcanic sand of another contested beach. His death was mourned by the Marines who had served with him, but it changed nothing about the war's trajectory. American forces would continue to advance, continue to apply overwhelming material superiority, continue to transform industrial capacity into tactical dominance. The broader implications of Roi-Namur would ripple through Japanese strategic thinking for the remainder of the war, though never explicitly acknowledged in official communications. The battle demonstrated that Japanese defensive doctrine, which assumed that prepared fortifications manned by dedicated defenders could inflict prohibitive casualties on amphibious assaults, was obsolete against an enemy capable of bringing sufficient firepower to simply obliterate those fortifications. This realization would inform the increasingly desperate defensive measures employed on Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. The shift toward deep cave systems and defense in depth designed to maximize American casualties rather than actually hold territory. But even these adaptations could not resolve the fundamental asymmetry. Japanese forces were fighting to make American victory too costly to sustain, hoping that casualties would erode American political will. American forces were fighting to apply industrial capacity until Japanese resistance collapsed through sheer material exhaustion. These were incompatible strategic visions, and only one could be validated by reality. The soldiers of the Japanese garrison on Roi-Namur had expected to face Americans softened by abundance, corrupted by luxury, lacking the spiritual strength for sustained combat. Instead, they encountered Americans who had weaponized that abundance, who brought their industrial might directly to the battlefield, who used material superiority not as a crutch, but as a devastating tactical advantage. The cognitive dissonance this created between what Japanese military philosophy insisted should happen and what actually occurred would never be fully processed by Japanese command structures. It would simply be overwhelmed by subsequent defeats, each reinforcing the lesson that spiritual dedication, however intense, could not overcome material disparity of sufficient magnitude. There is a letter, preserved in the Marine Corps archives, written by a sergeant who fought alongside Tony Stein on Roi-Namur. The letter, addressed to the sergeant's wife, attempts to describe what he witnessed. "I saw something today that I still don't quite believe, even though I watched it happen. One of our boys, Tony, a corporal from Ohio, He went through the Jap lines like they weren't even there. He had this crazy gun he built himself, and he just kept moving forward, kept firing, kept going back for more ammunition, and then doing it again. The Japs threw everything at him, and he just kept coming. I don't know if it was bravery or stubbornness or what. But by the time the sun went down, he'd single-handedly destroyed more positions than most companies could take out. The officers are talking about a medal. I'm just talking about the fact that I watched one man do what should have taken a battalion, and he made it look like craftsmanship, like he was solving problems at a factory instead of fighting a war. I don't know what the Japs expected when they decided to fight us, but I don't think it was this. I don't think they expected us to bring America with us to the battlefield. The letter captures something that official reports cannot, the sense of witnessing a transformation in the nature of warfare itself. For thousands of years, combat had been primarily a test of individual courage, unit cohesion, and tactical skill. Material factors mattered, but they existed within constraints that limited their decisive impact. But the Industrial Revolution had changed this calculus, and World War II was the first major conflict to fully demonstrate the implications. When one side could produce weapons, ammunition, supplies, and equipment at an order of magnitude greater than the opposition, traditional military virtues became insufficient. Courage still mattered, but it had to be coupled with logistics. Dedication still counted, but it required material support. Tactical skill remained crucial, but it needed technological superiority to achieve full effect. Tony Stein's assault on Roi-Namur was not an anomaly. It was a preview of warfare's future. Combat as applied industrial capacity, victory as the outcome of production efficiency, strategy as the management of resource superiority. The Japanese defenders who died in those bunkers were not defeated by superior courage or tactical brilliance. They were defeated by the capacity of American factories to produce more ammunition than one Marine could fire in a day of continuous combat, by the logistics system that ensured that ammunition reached the battlefield, by the training programs that taught Marines to use improvisation and technical skill as weapons in themselves. In the decades after World War II, military historians would debate the factors that determined the Pacific War's outcome: strategic decisions, leadership quality, tactical innovation. All received extensive analysis. But beneath these higher-level considerations lay a simpler reality. American industrial output exceeded Japanese capacity by margins that rendered tactical and strategic considerations almost secondary. The United States produced approximately 300,000 aircraft during the war. Japan produced approximately 76,000. American shipyards launched nearly 2,700 major warships. Japanese yards managed approximately 600. The ammunition disparity was even more stark. American forces could afford to expend thousands of rounds per casualty inflicted. Japanese forces rationed bullets. These numbers translated directly into battlefield outcomes. An American Marine Corps rifle company landed on a Pacific atoll with more firepower than a Japanese battalion. American artillery could afford to conduct harassing fire throughout the night, denying rest to defenders because ammunition supply was effectively unlimited. American tanks, aircraft, and naval vessels could afford to engage at range, using superiority in fire control systems and ammunition availability to destroy Japanese forces before they could effectively respond. The Japanese military philosophy, with its emphasis on spiritual strength and willingness to sacrifice, was not wrong in any moral sense. It was simply inadequate against an opponent who had transformed warfare into an industrial process. The same American culture that produced mass production factories, standardized parts, and assembly line efficiency applied these principles to combat, creating a war machine that measured success in production schedules and logistics tonnage rather than individual heroism. Tony Stein's actions on Roi-Namur demonstrated this transformation at its most intimate scale. He was not a superhuman warrior or tactical genius. He was a trained craftsman who understood machines, who recognized that a weapon was a tool for solving the problem of enemy resistance, and who had access to sufficient material resources to apply that tool without restraint. The Japanese defenders who faced him were brave, dedicated, and tactically competent, but they were fighting with a philosophy designed for an earlier era of warfare, one where material constraints imposed limits that courage and dedication could overcome. That era had ended, though its conclusion would take another year and countless additional lives to fully establish. The evening of January 28, 1944, brought a strange quiet to Roi-Namur. The intense combat of the day had subsided into sporadic firing, Japanese survivors attempting to infiltrate American lines under cover of darkness, Marines establishing defensive perimeters and preparing for potential counterattacks that never came. Tony Stein sat in a shell crater, the Stinger disassembled for cleaning, his hands moving through the familiar motions of maintenance with the unconscious precision of long practice. Around him, other Marines ate K rations, smoked cigarettes, processed the day's events in the way that combat veterans do, through understatement, dark humor, and carefully controlled emotion. Someone asked Stein how he had managed it, how he had kept going through 8 ammunition runs, through wounds and heat and sustained fire. His response, recorded in multiple accounts, was characteristically unadorned. The gun worked, the ammunition was there, so I kept using it. Didn't seem complicated. This answer, so simple as to seem almost naive, actually encoded the entire transformation in 20th century warfare. The gun worked because American industry had produced it to specifications that prioritized reliability over cost. The ammunition was there because American logistics had transported it across thousands of miles of ocean and ensured its availability on the beach. The capacity to keep using it existed because American training had prepared Marines to maintain and operate equipment under field conditions. None of this had anything to do with spiritual strength or willingness to die. All of it depended on industrial capacity, technical training, and logistics infrastructure, the unglamorous practical foundations of modern military power. The Japanese military leadership, confronting reports from Roi-Namur and similar battles across the Pacific, never fully internalized this lesson. They continued to emphasize spiritual factors, continued to seek victory through dedication and sacrifice, continued to believe that American abundance was somehow a weakness that could be exploited. Even as their defensive perimeters contracted, their supply lines collapsed, and their forces were methodically destroyed. Island by island, the official rhetoric maintained that spiritual strength would ultimately prevail. Reality disagreed. By war's end, the gap between Japanese military philosophy and combat outcomes had become a chasm that no amount of spiritual dedication could bridge. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki would bring immediate strategic consequences, but the Pacific War's result was already determined by the accumulated weight of industrial disparity, the millions of shells fired, the thousands of tanks and aircraft produced, the logistical miracle of sustaining offensive operations across the world's largest ocean. Japan had fought with courage and tactical skill, but courage and skill proved insufficient against an opponent who could afford to lose equipment, expend ammunition, and accept casualties at rates that would have crippled other nations, and still maintain offensive momentum through sheer material replacement. Tony Stein's Medal of Honor citation would emphasize his aggressive initiative and gallant fighting spirit, language that situated his actions within traditional military virtues. But the citation could not capture the more profound significance of what he accomplished, the demonstration that American warfare had evolved beyond individual heroism into systematized industrial violence. The Stinger was not just a weapon, it was an expression of American manufacturing capacity, of the ability to produce specialized tools for specific tactical problems. The 8 ammunition runs were not just resupply trips, they were evidence of a logistics system that could maintain combat units in action regardless of expenditure rates. The 26 destroyed positions were not just tactical victories. They were proof that material abundance, properly applied, could overcome any defensive preparation. The Japanese soldiers who died in those bunkers never understood what had killed them. They expected to face enemies who would break under fire, who lacked the spiritual strength for sustained combat, whose abundance would prove to be weakness. Instead, they encountered an enemy who had weaponized that abundance, who brought America's industrial might directly to the battlefield, who fought not with spiritual dedication, but with overwhelming material superiority. The cognitive gap between expectation and reality remained unbridged at the moment of death. 70 years after Roi-Namur, the lessons of that battle remain relevant to understanding modern warfare and the nature of military power. The specific technologies have changed. Precision-guided munitions have replaced machine guns. Drone strikes substitute for tank assaults, information networks enable coordination that World War II commanders could not imagine. But the underlying principle persists. Industrial capacity translates into battlefield dominance, logistics determines operational success and material abundance. When coupled with technical skill and tactical competence, becomes the most decisive weapon in any nation's arsenal. The United States military continues to emphasize this approach, spending more on defense than the next 10 nations combined, maintaining global logistics networks capable of deploying force anywhere on Earth, investing in technological superiority across all domains of warfare. Critics sometimes describe this as wasteful, as overkill, as the application of excessive force to problems that might be solved with precision or restraint. But this criticism misunderstands the fundamental philosophy that Tony Stein exemplified on a Roi-Namur beach, that overwhelming material superiority, the capacity to bring more resources than strictly necessary, creates tactical and strategic options that more austere approaches cannot match. This is not a celebration of waste or excess. It is a recognition that warfare, at its core, is a contest of will and capability, and that when one side possesses vastly greater capability, will becomes less determinative. The Japanese defenders of Roi-Namur possessed extraordinary will, dedication, and courage. They lost anyway, not because their will was insufficient, but because will alone could not overcome the material disparity they faced. No amount of spiritual strength could conjure ammunition when stockpiles were exhausted, repair tanks when spare parts did not exist, or stop American advances when every destroyed position was simply bypassed by forces with sufficient strength to render static defenses obsolete. The photograph of Tony Stein beside the disabled Japanese tank remains in the archives, a grainy image that few people have seen, documenting a moment that changed nothing about the war's grand trajectory and everything about understanding how wars are actually won. If you examine the photograph closely, you can see details that tell the larger story. The abundance of equipment visible in the background, supply crates, ammunition boxes, jerry cans of fuel stacked in organized rows. The other Marines visible at the frame's edges, all carrying full combat loads, weapons clean and maintained. The disabled tank itself, intact except for the specific damage Stein inflicted, demonstrating that Japanese engineering was competent. But Japanese industry could not produce enough to matter. These details encode the reality of industrial warfare. Victory belongs not to the most dedicated, but to the best supplied. Tactical success comes not from willingness to die, but from capability to destroy. Strategic dominance emerges not from spiritual strength, but from economic capacity. These are uncomfortable truths for military traditions that emphasize honor, courage, and sacrifice. They are also inescapable truths for anyone who studies modern warfare without illusion. Tony Stein carried these truths with him to Iwo Jima, where they could not save him from a sniper's bullet, but they survived his death, embodied in the Medal of Honor citation, preserved in the after-action reports, encoded in the Stinger itself, and the philosophy it represented. American abundance was not weakness. American logistics were not corrupt excess. American industrial capacity was not spiritual poverty. They were weapons as devastating as any bomb, as decisive as any battle, as transformative as any military innovation in human history. The Japanese soldiers who expected American Marines to break under fire were not foolish or uninformed. They were simply trapped within a philosophy that had become obsolete, fighting a war that had already been decided not on battlefields, but in factories, not through courage but through production capacity, not by spiritual strength, but by industrial output. They died bravely, defending positions they believed were impregnable, fighting for a cause they considered sacred, maintaining discipline and tactical competence until the moment of death. And they lost anyway because Tony Stein had ammunition, and they did. Not because American factories could produce weapons faster than Japanese soldiers could destroy them, because abundance in the end proved stronger than dedication. This is what Roi-Namur taught. This is what 26 destroyed positions in a single day meant. Not that individual courage was obsolete, but that it was insufficient. Not that tactical skill no longer mattered, but that it required material support to achieve effect. Not that warfare had become simple, but that its fundamental equation had changed, and those who failed to adapt would find themselves fighting not just against an enemy, but against the accumulated weight of industrial civilization itself. The dawn that broke over Roi-Namur on January 28, 1944, illuminated a new era of warfare. Tony Stein, with his improvised weapon and methodical destruction of Japanese defenses, was both its herald and its embodiment. The battles that followed, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and all the unnamed struggles of the Pacific, war would reinforce the lesson again and again until it became undeniable. In modern warfare, the nation that brings abundance to battle will triumph over the nation that celebrates deprivation, and no amount of spiritual strength can overcome the simple, brutal mathematics of industrial capacity properly applied. If this story of courage, innovation, and the untold realities of war moved you, honor these heroes by hitting the like button and subscribing to our channel. Every subscription ensures that stories like Tony Stein's are never forgotten. Share this with someone who needs to hear about real American resilience. More incredible World War II tales await. We'll see you in the next one.